Let me start with just showing you a little bit of discrimination levels that the Agency for Fundamental Rights has collected through a survey on minorities discrimination. The statistics result from a research from a survey that was conducted in 2008, but this should not mean that these discrimination levels are not still representing the reality. As you can see, the following countries where research, Roma were asked to what extent do they experience discrimination in different areas of life, housing being also one of them. And as you can see on the screen, the average rate of discrimination that Roma respondents reported is extremely high. Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Greece, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. A footnote, levels of 26-25% of Roma reporting discrimination is on the lower end of the scale, yet at the scale of comparison of discrimination experienced by the majority population is extremely, extremely high. So these are definitely not good news to write home about, and I think that is an important point to make, just in case someone would like to compare the 64% that Roma reported on discrimination in the Czech Republic and in Romania. At the same time, in the same survey, we have asked also a question about awareness of laws that prohibit discrimination when it comes to renting or buying a flat. And as you can see on the screen, the awareness of such laws is not impressive. The explanation for that is twofold. First of all, the equality bodies that are also represented here, I'm very pleased at this conference and will be able to speak about their work actually later in the working groups, have been established relatively recently, and also do not enjoy adequate resourcing that would allow for them to develop awareness raising to the extent that would reach vulnerable groups and inform them about their rights, responsibilities, and possibilities to seek redress. So there is still a lot of feedback with regard from this data as to where awareness raising of fundamental rights, and specifically on Roma, because these are results from Roma respondents, could be directed to. Specifically on housing, the Fundamental Rights Agency has conducted a research that looked into the housing conditions of Roma and travelers in EU member states. The research was conducted by use of a variety of methodologies. As you can see, we have produced not only the comparative report that looked at issues of discrimination, segregation, forced evictions, but also on issues where we were trying to find some illustrations of promising practice or examples that could be inspirational for use by policymakers and further promotion with regards to systemic response. I think the point made earlier by the UN rapporteur on housing that, yes, good practices exist, but at the same time they are not intertwined and linked back to the systemic policies, being those social inclusion policies or integration policies or specific urban plans, is a really valid point. And it's a point that is resulting also from our research. Very quickly on the key findings, because time is running, a lot of will be discussed in the working groups, and also previous speakers have mentioned a number of the obstacles. So a large number of Roman travelers in the EU do not enjoy equal treatment in respect to housing. Evidence of that being results from the survey that I've just talked about, but also other research. Many live in substandard conditions, which fall far below even the minimum criteria of adequate housing. And that criteria of adequate housing, I think when we mention this, we should keep in mind the UN standards on housing, which are very specific as to what housing should look like and what it means to implement human rights in the area of housing. Many live in shanty towns, in temporary camps, in segregated and hazardous area, environmentally hazardous, resulting also to temporary or permanent health damage. Poor access to public services, employment, and schools leads to further isolation. Electricity, water, gas is inadequately planned for when it comes to extension of the public utilities and infrastructures in areas which are primarily inhabited by Roma. And last but not least, also the rights awareness on the part of Roma, but also rights awareness on the part of those responsible for actually implementing the policies is relatively minimal. The research looked into the situation with regard to national policies. Whereas there have been specific initiatives on Roma, perhaps to address residential inclusion in few places, the improvement of the housing conditions proportionally, and also long-term planning, long-term vision as to how to build communities, how to build local communities, both majority and Romani communities together, is lacking behind. There is an alarming question concerning the monitoring of the impact of housing initiatives, and it goes also to the projects. And I'm speaking here not only to the EU members of the decade, but also to the non-EU members of the decade, because at the last meeting, steering committee meeting of the decade, an important call was made by the Czech presidency to, in fact, look into the action plans in the decade and start monitoring the actual implementation. So this is really needed for all decade countries. Lastly, and that is linked to the policy and to the joined-up governance point made earlier by earlier speakers, is that the regional or local authorities are not often willing to implement those national housing policies that exist on a national level, or even those policies that exist in relation specifically to Roma. I will not spend too much time talking about good practice. There's a specific workshop dedicated to that, and those interested can also pick up the reports outside that do enlist the good practices. The FRA has a very specific role in the EU context, and I think we should be fully aware that our research and data collection is aimed at policymakers at the EU level, at the national level, and also at the local level to some extent. And there what we try to do is, in fact, promote implementation of fundamental rights in different areas of life when it comes to Roma, and also in different topics. When it comes to EU institutions, the FRA has suggested that positive measures to groups that are recognized as excluded and disadvantaged is strengthened, that there is a strengthened coordination at the EU level with regard to exchange of good practice among member states, and there is also a consideration to the allocation of structural funds related specifically to housing, and the member states adopt and implement comprehensive action programs based on equality, opportunity, and the segregation plans. The report, these suggestions were made in 2007-2008 to the European Commission, and I believe that to some extent we have seen important development with regard to adjustment made in the context of structural funds, and I hope that the next speakers will address this issue. When it comes to member states, similarly, the FRA is always suggesting that the EU legal instruments are fully used, that the financial instruments are fully used, that there are new opportunities opened for developing inclusion policies for Roma and travelers. This is indeed the case. Now, resourcing of equality bodies is essential, and that is something that we also promote not only through this finding, but also through a report that looks specifically at the human rights architecture at the national level. We have to enhance implementation of policies and also to explore how the multi-level governance related to partnership between the local and regional authorities, between the equality bodies and NGOs could be further strengthened. In order to proceed with that, and that leads me to an example how FRA engages with local authorities, we in fact proceed with in the different forms of seminars, discussions, to explain how these measures, how these recommendations could be implemented in practice. What I can present to you today is that outcome of a discussion that we had with local authorities in Romania in May last year, where basically clearly it was identified that there is a need for methodological framework for developing housing projects, that there needs to be a little bit more consideration for actually bringing in the common basic principles of Roma inclusion, which were adopted at the EU level quite recently, to the planning of the local policies with regard to housing. There also needs to be a clear and transparent legal framework in the member states and clear responsibilities on each level. Sometimes the confusion whether authority can apply for this funding or cannot apply for this funding is relatively elementary and can be avoided. We also found that perhaps setting up an independent institutional mechanism to assess, monitor, and recommend better implementation of housing policies and projects locally would be beneficial. Such an example exists in Spain, where there is an ombudsman on housing rights. And lastly, through the discussion with private sector, we also found out that the private sector is quite interested in promoting implementation of human rights, and that's perhaps a new partner to bringing into the debate. So finally, I hope that over today and tomorrow we'll be able to actually address some of these points. To summarize, high levels of discrimination, still inadequate response with regard to national level policies, but also a huge potential with regard to the reforms that have taken place already in the context of the financial frameworks at the EU level. Thank you.